CEU Medieval Radio, Past Perfect, the talk show about medieval and early modern culture. Hello and welcome to Past Perfect, CEU Medieval Radio's show on medieval and early modern culture. My name is Kinde, and I am here today with Martin Pjecha, who is an advanced PhD student at CEU and also a research fellow at the Center of Medieval Studies in Prague. Martin is about to finish his dissertation about the perception and discourses on physical violence in 15th century Bohemia. Hello, Martin. Nice of you to come and visit us.
It's my pleasure. Hello. Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about your current research projects? What are you dealing with and what are your sources?
Yeah, so I'm dealing with the so-called Taborite movement. And this is, well, to put it very briefly, who were the Taborites? They were a radical wing of the Hussite movement. Most people might have heard of that. And they become, apocalyptically minded, and then they become revolutionary, which means basically that they see themselves as participating in apocalyptic events through violence, through revolutionary action. And what interests me especially is how does this transition happen from what we can call like pacifist, sort of escapist, apocalyptic thought, which is actually the typical mode of thought in the Middle Ages, into what we can call like a revolutionary activist mode of apocalyptic thought, because we don't really see this anywhere else in history. So this is why the Taborites are so interesting for me. My sources, I'm especially approaching it from, you could say, intellectual history perspective. So I'm dealing with anything I can find, but especially sermons, theological debates and polemics, letters, anything that sort of the Hussite and then Taborite leaders might have said to inspire some kind of action from their followers. So this is, briefly put, this is my interest.
Mm-hmm. I'm not very well versed in this area of European history, so could you tell us a little bit about the context? What is happening in Bohemia at this time, and how can we imagine these Hussite Wars?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, the context is very complicated. So the Hussites begin, we probably heard of Jan Hus, begin as a reform movement in Bohemia, in Prague. So this is the time of the schism, a time when people are exactly uncertain of their own salvation, how to attain salvation, which pope should we follow? At some point there's even 3 popes, as you know.
Oh my.
So people are asking themselves, it becomes a very complicated question. And so there are some movements, Hussites are not unique to this, that begin to actually avoid the clerical church altogether and look exactly to the sources, what they see as the sources of Christianity. That is scripture. So the Hussites begin as such a movement, of course influenced from various thinkers abroad, but begin to measure, let's say, the clerical church around them based on the measurements of what they thought God meant the church to be, based on the so-called pre-Constantinian church, so the Church of Christ and his first apostles. And what they see is that the church around them doesn't measure up. They're simply, politics and religion are combined, and the clergy is more interested in gaining wealth and power than they are preaching sermons to their flocks. And of course, Prague is maybe a unique case because there's some studies done that an especially high number of priests existed proportionally in Prague, which was one of Europe's biggest cities at the time. So maybe the so-called sins of the clergy were especially visible to people. And so it begins in the university, Charles University, this movement of reform, which is basically simplifying the clergy taking away their political and economic wealth, basically to purify them so that they can focus on their main task at hand, which is making sure that people are living according to the norms that are set in Scripture. So this is the beginning of the what is called the Hussite movement. Jan Hus. Of course, this gets into conflict with the church because actually this questions the very authority of the clerical hierarchy. And at some point, the Hussite leaders begin to consider actually the clerical hierarchy as the exact problem. Even the Pope, who they begin to call as the highest Antichrist, because after all, he is the leader of the entire movement away from scriptural norms. He is the head of this sort of perversion in history. That's the way they see it. So he is called to Constance in 1414 to, both sides think they're achieving something different, because Hus thinks he's coming there to preach and to convert and to reform the church, while the council is simply wants to hear him defend himself against charges of heresy. So they have, of course, different objectives. He's thrown in jail shortly after he comes, and long story short, he's executed as a heretic. So this happens in 1415. The Taborites are still a few years away, but what we see happening in the meantime is, he was immensely popular, even with the nobility. So the nobility and the population sort of are outraged by this execution and decide to defend themselves against further persecutions. Now it gets very complicated because the Hussite, let's say, movement becomes so big that actually there are, and it comes to actually be spread over the whole country, that it's impossible to maintain a sort of unified front.
Yes.
So there you have sort of more moderate wings, sort of the university where it all started, the nobles, and you have more radical wings which begin in the countryside. And the Taborites come out of this sort of more radical approach, which really wants to go to a return to the most simplistic theology and the most simplistic liturgy. They come into conflict with the sort of moderates, so on and so forth, until 1419. And this is when there's the Prague defenestration, when radical Hussites in Prague depose the town council, actually throwing them out the windows.
Oh, I see.
This is seen as a revolutionary act. The king dies, and then these Taborite groups in the countryside start meeting, and they increasingly see events around them as apocalyptically charged. So they begin to interpret their own persecution or their own liminal sort of status as a sign of the end times that are coming. And this is the birth of the Taborite movement. They begin to meet on hilltops, which they flee to, sort of, because they really expect the end times to come very soon. And then something happens. The predicted time of the end, nothing transpires at that time. Like, Christ doesn't come to cleanse the world. So they see themselves actually as necessary participants in this sort of world cleansing, this apocalyptic renewal.
So if Christ is not doing it, then they should start doing it.
Yeah, it's not put in so many terms, but they see themselves exactly as the angels, the heavenly army that has to in a way participate.
And how many people are we talking about? So is this like a huge % of the population, or?
This begins as thousands of people. We don't have very reliable numbers, I think. We have chronicles that say that the first Taborite meetings are 10,000 people.
That's a lot.
I mean, they eventually come to form this town, this fortified town of Tabor. So you can imagine it as the size of a town. But maybe their influence is broader than this because they become very successfully militarized and are very important for the Hussites in general in what comes to be known as the Hussite Wars, because they're sort of the military backbone of the Hussites. So the Taborites stay kind of relevant in this way, even though there's always polemics within the broader Hussite movement over issues of liturgy and over theology and so on, which then ends in the split of the movement at the end of the Hussite Wars and, well, the defeat of the Taborites. And the moderate Hussites kind of go back into the church nominally, but are sort of a church within a church. And this is an extremely complicated case, which exists then into the 17th century. So for 200 years, there is this church within a church in Bohemia, and it's unresolved until the Battle of White Mountain in the 30 Years' War. So it's a long explanation, sorry, but that's the context, let's say.
Thank you. You've given a very thorough explanation. Okay, then what is your perspective in this, and what is your main subject, so to say?
So as I said, there's this transition that happens in this early part of the Taborite meetings when exactly the sort of what I call this passive idea of apocalyptic thought, which is that sort of the God's elect have to hide away somewhere and wait for divine forces to cleanse the world. And then there's this transition which takes place where suddenly the Taborites see themselves as agents that have to actually assist in this or somehow participate in this world cleansing. And what's interesting to me exactly is, first of all, I don't think you see this anywhere else in Europe before that, in the West. So this is kind of something that bears explanation, that requires explanation. We can't take for granted why this would happen. So this is the question of my project, is how could this, what did they think they were doing actually? And how did this novelty come about?
And what do you think they were doing?
Well, I just gave a talk on this in a conference, but very broadly speaking, I think we have to take into consideration not only the apocalyptic background, but also what is called in literature or the realist, or let's say Neoplatonic background, which I think is nothing new. I'm not presenting that anything new, that the Hussites were influenced by Neoplatonic thought. That's already well known. But the fact that it sort of came out of the university circle and it was translated into, let's say, vulgarized into Christian terminology and vocabulary, which then sort of combined with the apocalyptic narrative. So I think what's important in the Neoplatonic sort of cosmology, I don't want to get too technical, so stop me if...
Yeah, in layman's terms, how could you explain this?
Yeah, basically the idea is that the human being has to actualize his potential. And this is behind, let's say, the broader, what's more broadly called medieval humanism. That the human being is not simply a set substance, let's say, but has to actualize his potential. And in this context of the Taborites, what they're seen as actualizing is actually their faith. Their faith has to be something that is displayed. It has to be performed, if you want. It can't be taken for granted. And over time, this performative dimension, which is very clear for what the clergy have to do to perform. It's very clear what the king has to do to perform. He has to sort of police the society in a way, cleanse it from sin. But it's not clear at all what the laity should do to perform. So there's, on the one hand, a very aggressive rhetoric from the Hussites who say that you have to, every Christian has to resist the Antichrist. But it's never clear what this means in practical terms to a layman who is supposed to be, according to like medieval sort of stereotypical political thought, is supposed to be just a passive non-agent, right?
Yes.
And at some point, I think that this combines with the urgency of apocalyptic thought, which somehow creates an extreme anxiety within lay people that I have to act. It's not clear to me how I should act, but if I don't do something, then I will be sort of labeled amongst the damned because I have to perform my faith. And I think, to simplify things, I think that this is behind exactly this revolutionary inspiration. To get more, I would have to go into finer detail, but this is the basics.
Okay. My question regarding this, as a historian, so what is the methodology you use to uncover these thought processes?
That's a very good question, because actually the radical Hussites and Taborites are not at all explicit about their sources. So you cannot simply say, this is citing the Timaeus, the Plato, and therefore. They very rarely cite anything other than the Bible, sometimes a couple of non-biblical prophecies, but that's about it. So you have to really do sort of an intellectual history and a discourse analysis to in a way trace these ideas and where they come from. And this is difficult, but it can be done. And I think it's important that it's done, because in this way you can sort of uncover these translated discourses that are translated from, let's say, high academic thought through sermons into popular sort of vulgar terms or Christian terms that would be sensible to people. So the method is very difficult. And it often takes you down black alleys that you think you've caught a thread, and this leads to a philosopher that you kind of remember somewhere from some text, and actually, no, it's impossible. So you are often just poking in the dark, looking for something, and it's speculative in this way. You don't have it's not a very positivist approach or result that you will find. So
you are looking for like these intertextual clues, and are you using any digital methods, for example, for that? Are you marking your texts in a certain way?
I'm so primitive that I'm not.
How do you deal with these illusions? And
yeah, it's always a matter of experimentation. I don't know. I'm sure I haven't found the perfect way to do it. I take lots of notes, and I use, when I find a phrase that sticks out to me, I use Google and search engines, and sometimes, databases of certain digitized sources. But I'm not that familiar with these digital methods, to be honest. And I'm not sure if they're really that up to the task of looking for shared quotations in manuscripts, for example. Hopefully one day.
Are you working directly with manuscripts, or are you working with critical editions?
Both, and non-critical, so early prints, some manuscripts, but mostly, I must admit, with published editions. Of course, there's a lot that I could still go through, and at some point I would like to, but as a PhD project, it's already kind of grown to maybe the maximum size that I can handle.
Understandable. So this is your PhD project, and is this the same thing that you are working on in the Center for Medieval Studies?
Yes. In the Center for Medieval Studies in Prague, my project is incorporated in the larger project, an ex-pro project funded by the Czech Grants Agency. And it's about conflicts in Central Europe in roughly the end of the Middle Ages, maybe beginning of early modern periods. So from Charles IV until the early 16th century. And here you have strife between nobles, between kings, dynasties. Of course, you have people like Sigismund and Charles, who are emperors, and so they have conflicts everywhere from Switzerland in the west to Hungary and the Ottomans in the east, and the Italian city-states, and then the Teutonic Order in the north. So this is sort of this very large geographical unit that the project that is sort of represented by individual projects in the overall scheme, and also from different viewpoints. So from economic history, diplomatics, things like what I'm doing, sort of intellectual history, and so it's interdisciplinary in this way, and even literature studies and chronicles, etc.
Thank you. Now we will take a short break and we will be right back. Welcome back. This is the second part of our interview with Martin Pjecha. Thanks for coming and being with us. I would like to ask a little bit about the Taborite movement that you have laid out. And were there any important figures that you could tell us a little bit about whose influence was noticeable in this line of thinking in the Taborite movement?
Yeah, that's a very good question, but unfortunately we don't have a very good answer because from the Taborites themselves we have very few actually sources. So we know that they had, internally they had some leaders. The best known of them is Mikuláš z Pelhřimové, and who was their bishop, who they elected. And we do have some sources from him. But for this very early period that I'm interested in, about, let's say, the most revolutionary, most radical, they were more or less liquidated in the first couple of years of the existence of the movement. So we have a couple of letters from a so-called Martin Pjecha, who was apparently one of the main figures in bringing this movement to its revolutionary stage. Also a so-called Jan Čapek, who the only source that we have, I think, is a recording from a hostile sort of, a re-recording of a pamphlet from a hostile observer. So it's always a question how to treat these kind of sources, how reliable they might be. But let's say for my research, when I'm looking at the background of the Taborite movement, of course there are influential figures that we have good sources for. Of course, the most central might be Jan Hus himself, who, well, I already explained who he was. And he was most important in sort of popularizing this reform message, so taking it out of the university context and sort of translating it into not only vulgar terms, but literally translating it into Czech, preaching in Czech. This is something that was quite restrained and quite still unique. Another thinker I think doesn't get enough recognition still in historiography is a certain Jakobek of Stříbro. He's the most important, he's best known for the beginning of the so-called Eucharist communion. So this is a theological novelty which the Hussites are known for, about giving the bread and the wine in the Eucharist, which up till then was, there's a long history behind it, that it existed in the original early church, and then somehow in the Middle Ages, for some reason or another, it was forgotten and ignored, and only the bread was given to the laity. So he renewed the practice of giving both kinds to the laity, which the council condemned as heretical, and so on. But I think his importance goes beyond this, especially in this sort of mystical, let's say, Neoplatonic background. He's the one who mainly awakens previous Czech so-called realist thinkers, Matthias of Janov, and brings them into the Hussite sort of corpus of intellectual sources. And this, I think, is very important later for the Taborites in, for example, imagining a body of the Antichrist, or imagining a normative way of acting as anti-Christianity or versus Christianity. And so there's many ways that I think he's very important, and he's kind of considered the father of the Taborites, even though he's definitely negligent father, because he...
How come?
Because when the Taborites come to existence, he immediately rejects them, and he rejects the violence. And I think this is one of the reasons why he has been sort of sidelined in maybe the Hussite research, or this specifically research on the Taborites. But I think that without him, you don't get the same Taborite movement, or he's much more of an apocalyptic thinker also than Hus was. So these are some main figures that I would highlight.
Thank you.
They are relevant for me, yeah.
So we have previously talked about these violent parts of the Hussite movement. Was there I mean, you already mentioned it, that there was also a more moderate side. Was there a completely opposite pacifist side? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, this is an interesting development that actually exactly at the time when the Hussites become the most radical and some of them become the most violent, you actually have some thinkers who become complete pacifists, which even the moderate Hussites were not. Even Hus and Jakobek were not pacifists in any way. They believed in legitimate use of force. But especially a figure of Petr Chelčický, who then becomes sort of revived in the post-Hussite Wars as the founder of, the spiritual sort of founder of the unity of brethren, who take up this pacifist message and exactly reject any kind of violence, even coercion from the state. And he's been, some historians see him as the first pacifist thinker, which, I don't know, is maybe debatable, but it's an interesting sort of opposite pole, opposite extreme to what I'm most interested in.
Mm-hmm. And did he have many followers? What was his influence and what was this
At the time,
pacifist?
That's a good question. At the time, he didn't have that much influence when he started in the early Taborite days. It's only after, actually, maybe also makes sense that it's after the Hussite Wars, when population is also exhausted from more than a decade of warfare, that also some radical thinkers revive him in a way, and revive in a way that the Taborite message of simplistic liturgy, simplistic life and poverty, but not combining it with any kind of revolutionary action. But his influence, I think, it's fair to say, is mostly in the second half of the century, when with the unity of brethren and its various successors into early modernity.
So can you tell us a little bit, to make the story round, can you tell us a little bit about how the Hussite Wars ended and what was the fate of the Taborites?
Yeah, that's good. Basically, the revolution, the Hussite Revolution, so-called, happens 1420, and there are crusades announced against them. So they've basically successfully taken a large part of the kingdom and its towns, and even a large portion of the nobility has sided with them. So the Council of Constance and the church announce a crusade against them. And what's remarkable is actually that, and it's taken for granted, that these trained soldiers, for example, Albigensian crusades, were basically slaughtering the heretics. But in the Hussite crusades, the Hussites are remarkably successful. And this is partially because of a new style of fighting. They introduce artillery into the offensive warfare, so they use these so-called Wagenburgen, or wagon forts, which actually no one knows how to deal with, because this is a completely new way of fighting.
So are these like siege towers?
No, they're like, if you imagine, just a normal wagon drawn by horses, and on the back you have a cannon.
Wow.
And of course this is a mobile artillery unit. Then if it cannot be breached by horses or infantry, and at the same time you're firing at them, and this, you have to realize, at the time has an enormous also psychological effect of being fired upon by artillery, which up until this point is mostly used only in defensive capabilities. So I guess most soldiers probably didn't ever see the effect of a cannon. And now you have this mobile sort of fortress, which can then sort of stand wagon next to wagon, and you can have people firing from behind it, and it creates complete chaos. So they're immensely successful against the First Crusade, Second Crusade, Third Crusade, Fourth Crusade, Fifth Crusade. And they're, this army, of large part of which is simply peasants with farming tools made into weapons, actually successfully is able to ward off professional soldiers and mercenaries. And this has an immense effect on their confidence.
Yes.
And suddenly these things that they said in the beginnings of the wars, that they are the elect, well, now it's obvious.
It makes sense. Yeah.
It's obvious that God is on their side, and that, the few are able to conquer the many, and the weak, the powerful, and so on. Until the church, well, a new council is called Ad Basel in the early 1430s, and it's clear that this has to be somehow dealt with because the military way is not going to work. So they invite the Hussites. Again, it's sort of like with Hus, that they are invited by the council in a way to defend themselves while they think that they're coming also to spread their message. So there are years, actually, of debates and polemics which happened between the council, and they have the so-called 4 Articles of Prague, which all the Hussite parties agree on. This is basically making the church poor again, so making it go back to its original message of preaching, free preaching of the gospel without restrictions from the hierarchy on what you can preach and when. Mm-hmm. The chalice, what I explained, this Uchaquist communion, and the punishment of sin. This was, I think, especially a Taborite article, the punishment of sin. So they debated on these 4 articles, the scriptural arguments for them, etc. And finally, the council was quite smart because they saw that there was a division, which I kind of hinted at the beginning, that there were these moderate Hussites and the more radical. And eventually the council saw this division and they said, okay, so what we can do is actually grant you the most important of these articles, which was the chalice, so the communion, which the Hussites saw as necessary for salvation. Actually, if you don't do this, there's no salvation. And maybe you drop the other ones. So eventually, the moderate Hussites agreed to this, while the Taborites never did. And so they split the movement in half in this way, and effective end of the Taborite military power comes in the Battle of Lipani, when Catholic forces unite with the moderate Hussite forces against the Taborites. And finally, the Taborites are defeated, they feel betrayed. They still exist in Tabor as a unit until the mid-century, but this is basically the end of the Hussite Wars, and the Hussites become, I think I said already before, they become a church within a church. Mm-hmm. And this is a phenomenon that exists into the 17th century. So this is brief history of the Hussite Wars.
Thanks. I would like to ask a little bit about the afterlife of this apocalyptic thought, because you're dealing with intellectual history. What did these thinkers, these thoughts have any influence after what has passed? Did other apocalyptic movements start, and can we trace any influence of these Hussites?
I think, the question of whether the Hussites had direct influence later on, I would say not so much. I mean, of course, within the region, they were always an entity, but let's say in the very broad picture, less so. But this combination that I'm studying of apocalyptic thought and revolutionary action, why I find it so interesting is because this is sort of what we take for granted in modernity, is that normal people, can actually have a voice and can actually enact an entire world-changing event, which is something relatively new in the history of Western thought. And into modernity, I mean, I think this idea of revolution, of upturning a social order or an entire state of being and transforming it into something completely different is unique to modernity. And it challenges where we put the Hussites kind of on the timeline of medieval modern. But then my broader interests are sort of revolutionary thought then into modernity. And I think that this is something, of course, that stays with us until today. But also the more sort of negative part of this is interesting in that, of course, the Taborites were revolutionaries, which we kind of associate maybe positively today. But I don't think any of us would want to live in their post-revolutionary world, because this was an extremely normative vision where there was no space for diversion. There was no space for heterogeneity. It was a completely homogeneous view. And I think this also is something in a way unique to modernity, that this forced, this really totalistic view of society that does not tolerate. I would have to go into more detail to compare it to the medieval perspective, let's say the traditional, but the Augustinian perspective more or less like tolerates some sins so that the greater sins are not do not grow out of these sins. But
so that's more of a balanced view if you let out.
Yeah, if it's like a release valve.
Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
Whereas for the Taborites, or let's say what I'm describing is a really totalistic vision which has no space for a release valve. It's black and white completely. And this, I think, what we see in modernity, the more frightening side of modernity, is also maybe a part of this. So it's not so easy to label them heroic or anything like that. And it's an interesting ambiguity, which I think that is worth exploring.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, I don't know if I answered the question, actually.
You gave an answer.
Yeah. I forgot the question by the end.
I think it was a comprehensive answer. So to conclude our interview, I would like to ask you about your future plans, if you have any, to continue this research or to delve into new topics, but also what do you foresee as interesting developments that can happen in this field?
That's a good question. So my own research future, well, I will finish my PhD soon, and I'm part of this, as I already explained, this project in Prague, which is a long-term project. So I'll be part of this, and I'm not thinking much past my PhD, to be honest. This is where my focus is. Of course, after this, if in the project I would like to maybe expand into the later Hussite Wars, when they actually become an offensive, when the Hussites begin to actually export this ideology abroad through literature and actually violence. And I think that's an important second part to what I'm looking at. Yeah, as for the field as a whole, well, Hussite studies is a part of it, but I think that intellectual history, discourse studies, etc. is important because it's relevant for me, but I think it's also interesting to see that people we would consider actually to be completely crazy, who have these crazy ideas about an apocalypse and things that are so outlandish, and actually then enact these atrocious acts based on this thought, I mean, completely massacring populations. It's too easy to say that they're crazy. And it's interesting to see the internal logic behind this. And actually, it's frightening sometimes to see how learned some of these people are. I mean, and that completely educated people are not only capable, but this is something we have to take seriously. And this, I think, also lines with today, maybe, that we cannot simply call as crazy some of the acts of extremist groups or people. It's much more important, but also interesting to see an internal logic behind it, also to properly be able to understand it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for coming and answering our questions.
Thank you very much for having me.